for the general plan update now underway. As climate leaders, how can we ensure that nature is treated as a critical stakeholder in our decadal planning process when traditionally natural systems have not been in the forefront of urban planning? We will continue to learn and search for the answers as we go through this process together. Tonight, we are so fortunate to have three presenters who bring deep understanding of the Petaluma River watershed and its systems. Callie Cole, David Keller, and Christina Toms will give perspectives on how we can best plan for our future. Our first presenter tonight is Callie Cole. She is an environmental planner with the Water Resources in Marin County, focusing on river restoration to improve habitat for endangered salmon. She also works on implementing river enhancement projects. Callie is also a board member of the Friends of the Petaluma River. Tonight, Callie will take us on a journey of the Petaluma River and speak to the issues and opportunities, including water quality, dredging, protections, flooding, and planning for sea level rise. Welcome, Callie. Take it away.
Thank you, Veronica, and good evening, everyone. And let me get my presentation up and running. How's that doing? Everybody see?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
So I'm going to start us off with an overview of the Petaluma River watershed. I'll be touching on some of the issues, looking at some of the constraints we have for planning, and then there's a few really golden opportunities we don't want to miss that I'll be pointing out. We're going to start down at the mouth of the bay. A lot of people, realize that Petaluma River is tidal, but knowing that when you're considering flooding and sea level rise, it's important to look out to the Pacific Ocean, not far from us, 13 miles to San Pablo Bay, and realize, the river is the conduit and the sea is coming for us. I think this is a beautiful picture. It shows a lot of wetlands and open space. Down at this is what Christina will be talking quite a bit about tonight, wetlands. But just in doing this presentation, I Googled wetlands and climate change and flood control, and it's just amazing what's out there. Little messages really popped up to me that, wetlands are the natural solution to climate change, and they are our best defense. They're sponges, they absorb floodwaters, they absorb carbon. So as we move through the evening, I want us to all keep our mind on the open space, which is the areas that we're planning for to protect us from flooding and from sea level rise, and to preserve habitat, as Veronica mentioned, the amazing biodiversity that we all want to celebrate and live with into the future. Starting at the mouth, I think some of you are familiar with the Sonoma Baylands project. It's a project by the Sonoma Land Trust and their partners, and designed specifically to help Sonoma Creek and Petaluma River deal with the sea level rise, the surging waters that will be rushing up to our downtown area, including, several feet that will be eroding banks and potentially threatening infrastructure. So these are levees built through these are breaches in agricultural levees, flooding old agricultural fields. So it's expensive work, it's time consuming, meaning that wetlands don't form overnight. But the foresight of the Sonoma Land Trust to think, way into the future on our behalf is something we really need to give thanks for. Moving into town, this is where we're going to be focusing most of our evening, the area under the general plan. You see on the right, the Schollenberger wetlands, and a lot of our dredge material goes out there. We're building up the marsh there. And you see the water recycling facility, Ellis Creek. This is an extremely vulnerable place for sea level rise. It's set at a fairly low elevation. So building up this marsh is imperative, and anything we can do to protect our infrastructure in a natural way that does create habitat is such a win-win. On the left, we have our amazing Petaluma Marsh, the largest remaining brackish tidal marsh in California. People come from all over to bird watch and paddle. It's quite an, a labyrinth of slough channels, Clavey Boats takes tours in there. They warn you, don't go in alone. You might get lost. It's quite something. And I think it's a natural heritage we should really celebrate. And as we move into a higher water situation with sea level rise, something to really keep an eye on to protect. We are a river town. A river runs through us. And our general plan and policy should really, really celebrate that. I think if you look at the user groups, the kayakers, we've got the lighted boat parade, cafes, people strolling, the boating, the North Bay rowing, Friends of the Petaluma River, the float house, the new Petaluma River Park. We really need to understand that these characteristics create what Petaluma is. We're not Roner Park, we're not Pengrove. We have a river running through us. And the general plan is a great opportunity to get excited about that and to try to focus development around that, to not cut off the river from our development, but to focus our development to turn towards the river, not turn our backs on it. It's a wonderful place, and we have a river town character. Along with the river running through your town comes the downside, the flooding, and these guys actually look like they're having a good time in this old lithograph, but you know, flooding was a problem. This is 1887, 154 years ago, and it is still a problem today. I think some of our speakers are going to be touching on this, David Keller perhaps. But the flooding history in Petaluma is extreme and severe. Some of these pictures were taken even after the Army Corps project was built. The lower picture of the Lindbergh Lane near the fairgrounds, the upper picture of the Outlet Mall underwater. The floods continue. Perhaps they're not flooding downtown and in the Payron neighborhood anymore, but the water is popping out of the channel and it's flooding our town. And it's a very serious situation to consider. Along with climate change comes this phenomenon called atmospheric rivers. And this was a study by the Army Corps and Scripps Engineering, Scripps Oceanography. And it shows that in 2019, Sonoma County was hit hardest out of 11 states for damage, economic damage from atmospheric rivers, $5 billion. So think of what we could be doing with that money instead of mopping up and bailing out and rebuilding. So we really, really need to go into this general plan with eyes wide open in terms of managing water, managing storm flows, managing the river. Forum, but this tool, if you haven't been online, is fabulous. It's really fun if you don't get depressed. You can see what we're up against. We have Petaluma River, Sonoma Creek, Napa River, and through the Carquinez Strait, through Vallejo, the entire Central Valley of the San Joaquin and Sacramento River systems, all pouring into San Pablo Bay. And then, you know, all the sea level rise coming in at the same time and all the floodwaters joining to meet to create scenarios like this one. When you go on and look at this tool, you can choose your sea level rise. So I selected 2 feet. That's very optimistic. The OPC says we should be planning for 5 feet. And I chose a 10-year storm. You know, most people will say, you need to plan for the 100-year storm. Oh, it's not a good, you should plan for the 200-year storm now. But just to be considerate, you know, conservative, so I wasn't, you know, causing undue alarm, I chose fairly conservative metrics. And those two combined with the storm flow coming down and the sea level rise coming up, we're looking at 52 inches of water that will pop out of the channel in all the red places. That's where the river has actually left the channel. The dark blue is 12 feet or higher, and the light blue goes up to 4 feet, 6 feet. So we really have a situation here to put our heads together and plan for. We do have a flood control project in town, and everyone's very excited that the Army Corps came back and dredged it for us. The project cost $100 million. It was paid for by our residents, by taxpayers. It included an element of terracing for flood control. And I want to be very clear to everyone online that terracing is a very destructive practice. It's not a nice little, oh, we'll just terrace here. It's bulldozing the channel and laying it back and hardening it and lining it with riprap. And what you do is you widen it. So you've created an in-stream storm basin, detention basin, which is really out of favor with regulatory agencies these days. It's not really how we should be dealing with our stormwater. And it creates a maintenance situation. This river will need to be dredged. This is actually above the turning basin, so the Army Corps does not dredge up here. But in order for the flood control project to retain its effectiveness, it can't build up sediment in the river. So we have a lot of conflicting issues here of how to create habitat and provide flood control. I think Roger Leventhal, who's on the General Plan Committee, will be a good, he's a colleague of mine at Marin Flood Control District, and he loves to talk about the geomorphic dredge, then creating a natural channel, not dredging the whole channel, just perhaps dredging a deep water mid-channel canal. So there's a lot of options there. The concrete weir at the top is at the very top of the flood control channel, and between that and upper river is where the natural river begins. So I want you to take note of that. The weir also holds back flood flows. So while we might not be flooding downstream, maybe we're flooding more upstream in the outlet malls or the auto row. And we do a lot of our flood control upstream as well. Is somebody's drawing on my PowerPoint? Well, okay. So the Army Corps project is also, the EIR for the Army Corps project is completely dependent on not a lot of river floodplain development upstream to protect the effectiveness of the project. And the EIR clearly states that floodplain development upstream of the weir will decrease the effectiveness of the project to provide flood control in our downtown. So let's keep that in mind as we move upstream and look at ways that we can prevent floodplain, or I like to say flood-prone development in the upper river. So moving upstream of the weir, you'll see the upper Petaluma River, and it's vast. It's what you see as you drive along the freeway. There's lands out on the river that are complete seasonal wetlands, like the parcel in front of you in this picture. There's some high ground that's very good for building, but the low ground here is a seasonal wetland. The entire, I like to call it the flood-prone terrace. People want to draw, especially developers, want to draw a 100-year flood line and build right up to it. Or they take the 100-year setback from the river and build right up to it. But that line doesn't exist on this map of flood-prone terrace. The entire terrace is protecting the downtown. I'm not going to get into the details of this particular development. Oh, it's under negotiation at this point, but the hydrology of this development showed that it would raise the water surface elevation downtown by 6 inches, or half a foot. So when we go backwards and we talk about what 2 feet of sea level rise can do to our, risk, why would we give up river capacity for development? We really, really need to rethink what it is. What does it mean to build along the river? And what does it mean to build impermeable urban development in general? I used to work for Santa Cruz, and they have a policy in their general plan that no water shall leave your site. You shall not impact your neighbor's property. You shall not do any direct runoff into the rivers or creeks. And we might be, capable of looking at some of those parameters as well in this general plan update. Basically, slow it, spread it, sink it, keep it on site, and treat it. The wetlands will treat it. I'm not going to go into detail, but we do have a TMDL in the Petaluma River for bacteria. And a lot of that is because runoff goes straight into the river from the dogs, and we've got a lot of different populations and animal husbandry. So we have a lot of contributing factors to the river. And now that it's dredged and the party boats are back, it's sad to think that people shouldn't swim in the river. They shouldn't even come in contact with the river at this point. So I hope we can work on water quality issues. Again, building in the flood-prone terrace at the top, you'll see the outlet malls underwater That project was built on the Floodprone Terrace, and now it's flooded. Okay, I got to speed it up here. Last but not least, I want to talk about the upper Petaluma River as our greatest source for natural habitat, oak, woodland, riparian forests, steelhead, birds, river otters. As soon as you get upstream of that weir, all the way up to the Corona crossing, you are in the most beautiful oak, river, riparian habitat possible. The River Enhancement Plan calls it our highest priority for preservation. And I believe this is the place we should really be focusing for a river parkway. There are people in our town who work for resource agencies in the past and see the potential for grants and creating a river parkway. So I'd really like to put that out there as one of our possible great things we could be doing with our general plan and with our vision. And lastly, I want to talk about above Corona. This is the place we should be doing flood control. We should not be terracing the lower river. And we should not be developing right up to the lower river, but we should be doing flood control above Corona, and even higher in the watershed is where it's most effective. But I just want to remind people that these flood control projects are expensive. All of the work we've been doing for years in the Denman Reach, creating sediment basins and storage basins and terracing the river, we will gain a foot of capacity. So we really need to treat that river as our source of, it's almost like a respect that we are not going to add more water into this river that is already trying to hold itself in the banks while it comes under atmospheric rivers and sea level rise and more impermeable surface from development. So I just want to end on this note that there's a lot of hope for our river. I think there's a lot of beauty. I want people to focus on the upper river for protection, and the riparian oaks as an incredible legacy for our community, and just keep the river in mind as we move through the general plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Callie, for that comprehensive overview. It really gives one perspective of how rich our environment is. Up next is David Keller, who is the Bay Area Director of the Friends of the Eel River, a former Petaluma City Council member, founder and director of the Petaluma River Council, as well as a former longtime board member of the Sonoma County Conservation Action. David will focus on the importance of our river and its setting in the general plan update. He will also cover building to the edge of safe and responsible, and touch on the importance of community involvement in planning for our future of the river, tributaries, wildlife, wetlands, and riparian forests. Welcome, David Keller. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you, Dave and Dan and other folks for putting on this program. And thanks to all the folks who are tuning in, as they say. This is important. Petaluma, and particularly our general plan rewrite or revision, which is underway. And I want to focus on three particular areas. Why is there a river in the general plan? What is a safe and responsible planning? And how do we get visions for the future actually integrated and installed within this next version of the general plan? It's hard work, it's complicated. I would say working with water is probably at least as complicated as health services or housing. And so we need all of your creativity and vision and willingness to dig in. One of the things I want to focus on is what was accomplished, or what has been accomplished from the general plan that already exists, what accomplishment was in the 87 general plan and 2005 general plan, and what needs to be done now. And one of the ways of looking at it is, what did we accomplish? What has yet to be done? And what did we fail? And I'm going to speak from a planning perspective, trying to integrate what Callie has brought in and what Christina will bring in. This is a river town. It's one of the few in the Bay Area that actually has a river running through it. When we were doing the Central Petaluma specific plan, one of the consultants said, you have an extraordinarily rare opportunity as one of the towns in the Bay Area, which is you have your downtown focused on the river. That's not common at all. And so how can we take advantage of it? What can we do to bring our river back to health, both in terms of water quality, in terms of fisheries, in terms of botanical ingredients, and certainly in terms of our recreational and economic use of that river. One of the things to focus as people consider what should go into the next general plan is, what do we love or like about the river? What do we dislike about the river? And how do we get there? How do we integrate that? How do we make our city for the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years into a town that we love now, that works for everybody, and that protects and incorporates the features of our river? And by that, I mean not just the river, but also the tributaries, the wetlands, both freshwater and saline, the oak woodlands, all the places that certainly the vernal pools and all the things that we may not see at all. And I think in some ways, a large number of people don't even know that we have a river. If you don't have to cross the river every day, if you're not heading downtown, you may not know that we're actually connected in this 13-mile reach to the bay. It is one of the most polluted, if not the most polluted, inflow to the San Pablo Bay. And we need to be working on improving the runoff and improving runoff from housing, from streets, from parking lots. We've done a great deal of work over the past 20 years in improving runoff from industrial activities. But dairy farming and other inflows to the Petaluma River are still problematic. And so how do we deal with ditches? How do we deal with places where you get runoff with pesticides, herbicides, so forth? That's a piece that we need to be paying attention to. We need to pay attention to the risks in planning and where we developed and where we will develop. And that means asking 3 questions on any development of any significant size. Is who gets the benefits, who gets the risks, and who pays? And those questions are not frequently asked in public. This was told to me by a world-class hydrologist who was working on the Petaluma River flood issues. And he said, never leave an engineer, sorry guys, never leave an engineer to answer those questions. Those are questions that should be made, or answers rather, or proposals made by people who are responsible to the public, meaning elected. Engineers need to provide their input, but not create the solution. Land use planners, their job is to understand what the community wants and help it get there, and not constrain the public from trying to express its creativity. So I'll get back to that in a few minutes. In the risks in the Petaluma River, 147 square miles in this watershed, we have, of course, flooding losses. We have habitat losses, water quality losses, environmental justice issues. By that, I can point to a couple examples. For instance, the flooding of Thompson Creek after Westridge was constructed. A large part of Thompson Creek on the west side flooded. The water agency had to come in and build a 6-foot high water bypass. Did Condiati pay for any of that? No. We have Dutra at our southern end. It's under county control, and we've gotten very little support from the county overall. in trying to keep Dutra out of our entrance, the entrance to Sonoma County, entrance to Petaluma. So general plan work has to be done hand in hand with the county. And if our supervisors don't understand the community values or aren't willing to step out and lead on that, we get things like Dutra. So far, it's been 17 years of battling legally, politically against that proposal. They haven't gotten in the ground yet. We hope to keep it that way, but that battle still continues. And in fact, I was told by, actually Bill Cordham and I were told by a former supervisor from one of the other parts in the county when we met with him about trying to move Dutra out of our planning area. He said, well, you people down there need to take your share of pollution, literally. That's not planning, that's destruction. It's destruction of our river, our wetlands, and our community. We can't let that pass through planning. So we need to be able to push back on our electeds when they head in the wrong path. We need to be able to push back on planners and their consultants. We've lost, actually, Dan, if you would go up to the first of the slides there. This is 3 slides from the Historical Ecology Report on the Petaluma River watershed. It's an extraordinary report available at the RCD. I think Copperfields has copies. San Francisco Estuary Institute and others have copies of it. This is a map from about 1850 of what the water resources looked like as Petaluma was beginning to be settled. And I want to focus your attention on all that large green area that's predominantly on the east side of town. And those are what are called wet meadows. They're a type of wetlands. And if you look at the blue lines, you go, wait a second, they don't reach all the way to the river. And that's because the east side, all of those tributaries used to stop and fan out across these green meadows, across these wet meadows. An incredible, rich wetland resource. And that was changed over the years by people channelizing those creeks so they went directly to the river. And of course, what that meant is the water got to the river faster, and that helped increase the flooding along the central Petaluma River. I also want you to look a little bit north towards Pengrove, the Denman Flats area. That's a huge flat area at the north end of town running up below the Cotati grade. It's all ag right now. When the Corps of Engineers was modeling their flood control project, they were limited and did not include any change in Denman Flat storage capacity. And that area is large and it stores a huge amount of water during the rainy season. You'll often see it flooded out there. And they were very clear, if that area is reduced in flood storage capacity, we will lose the flood protections that are built into the Corps' flood project. How much? Between loss of Denman Flats and any building beyond the build out of the 1987 general plan, the Corps of Engineers said, you will lose the protection of the flood project. Water will overtop the walls, the berms. You will see flooding in Payran from 4 feet to 1 feet, all at the loss of $100 million of investment in trying to protect residents and businesses from additional flooding. So people tend to be kind of careless with that. Developers, landowners want to be able to build to the maximum that they think they can. Planners are very happy to try and run that boundary of what's safe and what is risk-free as close as possible. Some examples of that, the Payran area that floods. I checked the 1950s, I forget what year it was, Planning Commission hearing on approval of Payran. Not one mention of flooding, yet they knew that that area was in the floodplain and floodway. The same was true with the outlet mall. We protested that it was being built too low and in an area that floods. They said, no, it's fine. The consultants, the planners, city council said it's fine. And that area has flooded now at least 3 or 4 times. Why? Because the river goes over bank. The same is true with downtown. The same is true with McDowell and Old Redwood Highway and the Washington Square Shopping Center. All of those areas flood in part because over the last century and a half, all of those streams, all those tributaries on the east side were channelized, and that water came in faster to the river, higher to the river than it did when it just ran over those grasslands, when it dispersed.
Sorry, David.
Yeah.
David, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say we're definitely out of time.
Okay.
So can you just...
I'll wrap up what I got. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Petaluma as a river town needs to pay attention to things like what Tulsa, Oklahoma did, one of the most flood-prone, damaging, and highest number of deaths from flooding, 5 rivers converging on Tulsa. What did Tulsa do? The same thing that the Corps of Engineers recommended in the Galloway report after the Mississippi floods, which is evacuate areas that flood. That's part number 1. Part number 2, stop building in the floodplain, protect only what is water dependent, and literally move everything else out of the floodplain. And so we're playing here with some fabulous opportunities for a river and also some incredible dangers. And we haven't lost lives yet, but given climate change, given the change in runoff, sea level increases, we're dancing with disaster. So I'll come back to some other pieces later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for that perspective and your ideas on how the community can respond to the river. Thank you. Finally, we are excited to welcome Christina Toms from the San Francisco Bay Regional Quality Control Board, a division of the California Water Boards. As an ecological engineer and senior scientist, she has over 18 years of experience in the protection and restoration of aquatic ecosystems. Her work at the Water Board focuses on planning, permitting, and regional monitoring of estuarine, wetland restoration, and climate change adaptation projects. In her free time, Christina also serves as a director of the California Native Plant Society. Christina will be showing us the importance of fostering diverse, resilient bayland and wetland habitats in the face of climate change. We welcome you, Christina Toms, to Petaluma, and the floor is yours.
Super. Thank you, Veronica, and thank you, Know Before You Grow. I appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'll make you all bigger because I like to be able to see my audience. There we go. There you all are. Look at those beautiful faces. Fantastic. Can everyone see my slides? Yes? Great. Yes. Okay, fantastic. So I was asked to talk about a very complex and nuanced topic. So I've got 45 slides in about 25 minutes. So I'm going to go through things pretty quickly, but we are going to have time at the end for Q&A. So please save your Q&A till the end so we can get through all this. And I will progress. There we go. Okay. So just really briefly, I do want to do a territory acknowledgement and acknowledge that the areas that I'm going to be talking about today, the Petaluma region, but also the broader Bay Area, are indigenous lands that were stolen from multiple Native peoples, including the Coast Miwok and the Southern Pomo. Colonization of these lands is ongoing because with the local very few tribes in the Bay Area are federally recognized, and that is leaving a legacy of injustice that we have to address. So really quickly, I'm going to go through a brief introduction to the San Francisco Estuary and its bayland habitats, including tidal wetlands. We're going to talk about the physical and ecological conditions and processes that support those systems, talk about the impacts of colonization and climate change on tidal wetlands and adjacent habitats, and then discuss some strategies to adapt to climate change and protect biodiversity. So the San Francisco Estuary is the largest estuary on the Pacific coast. It has a watershed of about 60,000 square miles. It contains 50% of California's freshwater, 90% of California's coastal wetlands, and over 7 million people live in the Bay Area directly, but the watershed provides drinking water to over 25 million people throughout the state of California. This is a really, really significant estuary. I would also point out that the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which drains into San Francisco Bay, is the largest inland delta in the entire world. So this is a really unique system. It's also a very young system. When we look at San Francisco Bay and its wetlands, we may think that they've been here forever, but they certainly haven't. 20,000 years ago during the Ice Age, when most of the Earth's water was tied up in these polar ice caps, the shoreline was actually 30 miles west of the Golden Gate past the Farallon Islands. And the bay was really just kind of a river going through low-lying areas. About 10,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended. We had rapid glacier melt, very, very rapid rates of sea level rise, about 20 millimeters per year. And that led to shoreline retreat at a lateral rate of about 30 meters per year. About 2,000 to 6,000 years ago, that rapid rate of sea level rise began to slow down, and that allowed a lot of sediment to drop out around San Francisco Bay and form the wetlands that we know and love today. So that level of sea level rise when it slowed down was roughly 1 to 2 millimeters per year, and that's going to be important when we talk about sea level rise later. So it's important to remember that these are delicate systems and they're really young. They haven't been here for very long. This is about what San Francisco Bay looked like prior to colonization. This is mapping done by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. I'm going to mention SFEI a lot in this talk. In my line of work, we rely a lot on their science and their data products. So before colonization, we had almost 200,000 acres of tidal wetlands around the estuary, around 51,000 acres of tidal mudflats, and 2,000 acres of natural salt ponds that were largely concentrated in the East Bay area. So what supports biodiversity in tidal wetlands? And I really appreciate Callie's comments earlier talking about how important wetlands are for flood control, for carbon sequestration, for wildlife habitat. I give a lot of talks like this, and I'm assuming that this group already knows why wetlands are awesome, and so I don't need to spend 10 minutes explaining to you why tidal wetlands are fantastic. So I'm going to talk about biodiversity in tidal wetlands and why that matters. We're talking a lot about biodiversity here in California these days. You know, California is one of 36 globally significant floristic provinces, and it's because we're so diverse. And biodiversity really it can refer to a lot of things. I'm going to talk about it referring to really two primary concepts. One is genetic diversity, so locally adapted and distinct populations of both rare and common species. So these are rare plants that don't live. They could be endemics, endemic locally, endemic regionally. But there's also geographic and community diversity. So this is when we have uncommon groups of species that we see in unique positions in the landscape, that maybe the species themselves may be relatively common, but they're in an uncommon position in the landscape and they're sharing their habitat with other species that where they normally wouldn't live together. And these are really, really important. And this kind of geographic and community diversity isn't often captured when we talk about rare and endangered species. So some of you may be familiar with some of our actually rare tidal wetland species. For example, this is salt marsh birdspeak. This is a beautiful salt marsh annual that is found in the San Francisco Estuary. These photographs are actually from a population down in Marin along the Sausalito bike path. But we also have rare ecotypes. These are yellow-rayed goldfields, a pretty relatively widespread common flower. You've probably seen it if you're out for a walk anywhere where there might be streams or some moisture. But we rarely find it in tidal marshes. And here's a population that lives downslope from vernal pools. You can see it's actually sharing habitat with pickleweed and saltgrass. So it's a very uncommon place for this species to be. Again, Johnny Nip, this is in the Castanea family. Again, this is another species that we typically find in vernal pools and seasonal wetlands, but we can also find it along the edge. This is a grass, a clonal native grass that is, again, typically found in uplands, but we can find it in these unique assemblages at the edges of tidal marshes. So what supports biodiversity in tidal wetlands? And if I can get one message through to everyone today, I want you to think about habitat complexity and habitat connectivity. And that's driven by a lot of things. So antecedent conditions, just what does the landscape look like? What are the landforms like? What are the substrates, the soils? What is the range of tides? What is the range of salinity in the wetland? What is the ability of physical processes, both from the fluvial watershed side and from the tidal side? What is the ability of those processes to actually work on the landscape? When you have flood flows, can they actually get up out of a channel and spread across the landscape, or are they confined, or the land's disconnected from the creek and the channels? And what is the ability of ecological processes, such as species establishment, reproduction, dispersion, competition? This applies to plants, to birds, to wildlife, to fish. What is the ability of the ecosystem, of the critters that live there, to actually function and grow and compete with each other and eat with each other and reproduce consistent with how they evolved? And these functions, these physical and ecological processes are most robust in what we call complete tidal wetlands. And this is a concept that's really well articulated in a 2015 document called the Baylands Ecosystem Habitat Goals Update, the Baylands and Climate Change. And basically what it says is that tidal wetlands that are connected to both the open bay and channels, as well as to uplands and watershed inputs of rivers and streams, those are the most diverse and resilient and productive and healthy tidal wetland habitats. Unfortunately, due to urbanization of the region, which I'm going to show you some examples of in a little bit, we don't have too many complete tidal wetlands left throughout the bay. We have some at China Camp, here in the upper right. In the lower left-hand, this is Rush Ranch in Solano County in Sassoon Marsh. This is Point Pinole over in the East Bay. These are some of the few examples in the entire San Francisco Bay region where tidal marshes actually have robust physical and ecological connections to both the open bay and terrestrial landscapes. And that gives these systems complex channel networks, microtopography, diverse substrates, and the ability to really respond to changes in their environmental drivers. This is another graphic from that Baylands Goals update showing the different types of terrestrial estuarine transition zones. These are all the different types of edge habitats that we used to have in the bay. And these were critical to the health and the diversity and the resilience of the bay's tidal wetlands. You had rivers coming in and depositing their sediment loads and introducing fresh water to the marshes. You had alluvial fans where you had uplands grading into tidal marsh. And so you had a real diversity that unfortunately we're largely missing now. And this is what those fluvial estuarine transition zones used to look like. This is where David did a really great job talking about some of these components of the historical landscape here in the Petaluma region, where you used to have these creeks that came out of the hills and then they dissipated into alluvial fans. They never actually directly entered the tidal marshes. They supported groundwater instead, and we had groundwater popping up near these wetlands. Again, very complex physical processes due to habitat complexity and connectivity that supported resilience and diversity. So what are some of the historic, ongoing, and future impacts of Western colonization? So again, here's what the Baylands looked like in 1800 prior to colonization, and here's what they look like as of 2009. We're currently doing an updated mapping, but for all intents and purposes, this more or less reflects modern day conditions. So we've got 90,000 acres of tidal wetlands that were converted to agricultural lands, 52,000 acres that were converted to diked wetlands, largely in Sassoon, 38,000 acres of tidal wetlands remaining, 38,000 acres of artificial salt ponds concentrated in the South Bay. We also had some in the North Bay, and then 31,000 acres of tidal mudflats. And that's what that change looks like. That's really significant landscape scale habitat loss. This is for the entire San Francisco Bay region. Look at all of these tidal marshes that we used to have. And remember, the Bay already supports 90% of California's tidal wetlands, and this is what's left on the modern landscape. Again, I want to thank David for already showing this historic graphic, or this graphic from the Petaluma Historic Ecology Study. So this is what the system used to look like. We used to have with some creeks like San Antonio Creek coming directly in, but a lot of creek systems not. We had wet meadows, vernal pools that were adjacent to the tidal marsh. But this is what we have now, a drastically simplified landscape that's really meant to support urban development and rapid movement of floodwaters off of the landscape, and not that slow it, spread it, and sink it that Callie referenced earlier in her talk. So this is a much less diverse and much less resilient system. We've lost 60% of the tidal wetlands in the Petaluma region, and over roughly 80% of the non-tidal wetlands, the vernal pools, the seasonal wetlands, the floodplain marsh, the wet meadow that used to characterize this region. We've also seen tremendous subsidence in our diked baylands, particularly in those areas of former tidal marsh that have been diked and drained to support agriculture. This is what the Sears Point region looked like when we were planning the restoration project many years ago. This is the Belmarine Keys area down in Marin. Basically, these areas have lost, in some cases, over 6 feet of elevation due to the oxidation and compaction of those formerly very organic peat soils. When they're diked and drained and no longer kept away from oxygen due to saturation, they literally turn into thin air. They literally oxidize, turn into carbon dioxide. And any of you who have driven through the Delta, you see this writ large. There's in some places in the Delta over 20 feet of subsidence, but we also have very, very significant subsidence in this region. And we've urbanized our systems so that our fluvial systems, our rivers and our creeks, are completely disconnected from our baylands. They're no longer depositing their fresh water or their sediment across the landscape, and they're really flowing directly into the bay, where they just can't commingle with our tidal marshes. So before colonization, we had abundant tidal wetlands connected to other wetlands, to uplands, to rivers and streams. We had a lot of spatial and temporal heterogeneity in hydrology, geomorphology, ecology, and as a result, we had really biodiverse, resilient tidal marshes. After colonization, our marshes are isolated from each other. They're in small patches. The Petaluma Marsh is the largest example of this. It's a giant marsh, and it's not really connected to much of anything else because of reclamation of the rest of the Petaluma baylands. And so we've got nutrient-enriched urban runoff that's coming from our developed areas. That's really limiting the ability of these physical and ecological processes to express themselves on the landscape. And as a result, we have vulnerable pickleweed monocultures.
Want more food?
Now I'm going to get into our ongoing and future impacts of colonization. I'm going to talk about climate change. So we've already seen 8 inches of sea level rise here in the San Francisco Bay region over the last 100 years. That's roughly equivalent to about 2 millimeters per year of sea level rise. But we're expecting that rate to dramatically increase, particularly once we get past mid-century, and especially if we keep on our current emissions trajectory. So this is some of the science from the Ocean Protection Council, the most recent sea level rise projections for the state of California. And this is what that looks like from a probabilistic standpoint. This is taking a probabilistic look at what different levels of sea level rise may be. So we have about a 66% probability that by 2100 we'll see between roughly 2.5 and 3.5 feet of sea level rise. But if things get really bad, there's a likelihood that we could see between 6 and 7, or perhaps even more, especially if we see catastrophic wasting of the West Antarctic ice sheet. On top of these very rapid rates of sea level rise that we're anticipating, we also have less sediment coming into the system to help our marshes keep pace with sea level rise. So we've seen about a third less sediment input making its way into the estuary from the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. It's due to a number of factors, including the passing of the gold rush, the slug of sediment that's left from hydraulic mining during the gold rush era, flood management and dam construction in the Sierra Nevada and in the foothills. And we also have uncertain sediment supply coming out of our local tributaries, including the Petaluma River. This is some very, very new work. Literally, this just came out 2 weeks ago from the San Francisco Estuary Institute, trying to make an assessment of what is the demand for sediment in the baylands of San Francisco to help the marshes keep pace with sea level rise, and what is the supply that's coming out of the region's various tributaries, including the Petaluma River. And basically, I know that there's a lot on this slide, but what I want you to take home is that the demand is, in most cases, going to be bigger than the supply. We're not going to have enough sediment for all of our wetlands and all of our restoration projects to keep pace with likely rates of sea level rise. What does that mean? We're going to see marsh erosion. We're going to see marsh drowning and downshifting. This is what that might look like. This was some modeling that was done by Lisa Sheely-Beers back in 2014. This shows what modeled drowning and downshifting under different scenarios of sea level rise and different concentrations of suspended sediment in the water column. And the take home here is that basically with higher rates of sea level rise and lower amounts of suspended sediment, a lot of our marshes, there's a very strong chance they could convert completely to mudflat by the end of the century. And that's a real danger. So what can we do to turn the tide? What can we do to support resilient biodiverse tidal wetlands in the Petaluma region and throughout all of San Francisco Bay? Well, I need you to think landscape scale. Planning needs to happen across parcels and across jurisdictions. And there's a fantastic tool that's been developed by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. My agency, the Water Board, funded this work. I'm one of the project managers. It's called the Adaptation Atlas. And what it does is it takes a cross-jurisdictional look at where certain types of nature-based climate change adaptation strategies, such as wetland restoration, beaches, horizontal levees, ecotone levees, all of these different approaches, where they might work throughout all of San Francisco Bay. So they broke the bay down into 30 of these units called operational landscape units, kind of an awkward title, but they're basically regions with shared physical processes and shared shoreline characteristics, shared watershed inputs. And here's the operational landscape unit map for Petaluma. So this is a very kind of broad scale mapping exercise of the different nature-based adaptations that could work in different regions of Petaluma to help provide protection from rising sea levels, as well as provide co-benefits to the environment. This is a graphic of the horizontal levee, which is a design concept that was developed by a number of my colleagues years ago to beneficially reuse wastewater, treated wastewater from treatment plants to basically create, instead of a steep, high levee, a low, gently sloped levee that uses treated wastewater to create a natural ecotone between freshwater marsh and tidal salt marsh. It attenuates wave energy, it polishes wastewater, it provides habitat, it provides carbon sequestration, it helps remove pollutants that can't be treated within a typical wastewater treatment plant process. So these are the kinds of solutions that we need to be thinking about, permitting, piloting, and strongly considering. I really want folks, when we think about future landscapes with regards to climate change, to think dynamically, not statically. The landscape that we look at when we look at a map today is not going to be what the landscape looks like in 30 years, and it's certainly not what things will look like by 2100. And I want you to think about reconnecting these systems to give them room to move, to evolve, to adjust to a changing climate. Places are only as resilient as the processes that connect them. And for any of you that are crafters or quilters, I want you to think about a quilt. And this is an art quilt done by Linda Gash. She's a wonderful artist in the South Bay who focuses on habitat restoration as a theme of her art quilts. And I want you to think about a quilt where it has patches of different colors, right? And when you make your quilt, you take your patches of fabric and you put them in a certain pattern. But you could also cut those patches and re-sew them in a different pattern, but you'd still have the same distribution of colors. It would still give you the same general impression, but it's not going to look exactly like the quilt that you made the first time with the patches. Well, that's how I want you to think about these bayland habitats. They're mosaics. They're going to change over time. They're going to want to change over time, and we need to give them the room to do that. You need to think about doing this over the long term. Phased adaptation pathways are something we talk about in the Adaptation Atlas that give you a plan for addressing uncertainty and allowing for flexibility over time by identifying what to do and when to do it based on predetermined thresholds and triggers. So here's an example of a phased adaptation pathway for sea level rise adaptation based on sea level rise triggers. And it gives you a lead time for planning measures, and then time to implement them, and then time for them to be effective. It's kind of like, think of it as a Gantt chart, a project management chart for climate change adaptation. And this is covered in the Adaptation Atlas. And in the next phase of the Adaptation Atlas, we're going to provide some examples of how to do that in different parts, how to do this, how to take this phased adaptation approach in different parts of the Bay. Process-focused planning. Focus on conserving broader habitats and landscapes, not just a specific patch or population of a species. Again, you cannot separate populations and communities from the habitats within which they're embedded. We're not looking at little patches of habitat. We really need to think of the landscape as a whole. And if we're interested in conserving particular species and communities, we need to identify what those communities and what are the knobs and dials we can turn to restore or manage or adjust those processes to support those species. So you see, I have a bunch of knobs and dials turned down here, from a mixing board, but these are some of the things, we can adjust. We can work with hydrology. We can adjust sediment type, supply and delivery. We can adjust plant dispersion and establishment and competition. And here in the Petaluma River Basin specifically, one of the huge knobs and dials that's at your disposal is the ability to strategically manage your sediment and use it as a resource instead of a waste product. This is a graphic that was developed by SFEI in conjunction with the Corps a couple years ago. And this is a project that we're hoping the Corps will implement, a pilot experimental project to look at the different ways that we can strategically place sediment on or near wetlands to help them keep pace with sea level rise. And this is absolutely a tool that Petalumans or Petalumians, I don't know what you call yourselves, but this is something you should absolutely be thinking about, because if there's one thing we know that the Petaluma River has, at least for the time being, it's sediment. So to conclude, the Petaluma region formerly supported a really diverse mosaic. Think of that quilt of baleen habitats. You had tidal wetlands, seasonal wetlands, streams, floodplains, uplands. But this complex system of habitats has been profoundly impacted and simplified by Western colonization. Climate change is going to further compound these losses by drowning and downshifting our tidal marshes and squeezing them in urban areas where they have nowhere to go and nowhere to move upslope. Landscape complexity and connectivity is necessary to maintain these biodiverse, resilient habitats. So conservation planning needs to identify the key physical and ecological processes that support these wetlands and give them room to work on the landscape. And you really have to do this within a long-term landscape scale framework. It's the key to developing cohesive, effective climate change adaptation strategies. And with that, those are my thanks. And if you have any questions, looks like I think that was 25 minutes. I'm not sure. Maybe 30.
Bravo. Thank you.
Thank
you
you
for going so quickly. And that was an information rich and comprehensive presentation. Wow, that was very informative. Thank you so much, Christina.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Callie, David, and Christina for your presentations. And now we're going to open it up for questions. So let's see, what do we have?
So the two that I caught that I don't think we've had specifically answered so far was in the very first presentation, there was some discussion about dredging above the turning basin. And I noticed Teddy Herzog asked about that. And then there was also a question about what can we do to freeze existing undeveloped riparian corridor prior to the 2-year plus approval of the general plan. So those two things are out on the table at least.
Well, I'll hit the first one. Oh, my camera looks a bit off. Sorry, there's no mic in here. I think it's the city is working with the Corps on an operations manual for the project. I saw them go by my wall. I live on the river, so we actually chatted with a bit of the group there. And my understanding is there's going to be a handing over of the project to the city. I might be getting this wrong though, so please correct me. But the upstream is the responsibility of the city. So it could be that Cinema Water gets involved. I'm not sure how that works, but there's a flood zone. So it's not the Army Corps. Then the second question, I don't believe is mine. Maybe David knows the next one.
One of the things that when we were doing the legal challenge to the approval of the outlet mall and taking lots of walks through that incredible area, and I encourage everybody to do that. SMART has built a paved pathway. You can pick it up at Payran if you want, behind Lucky's, and walk north. It's an incredible area. It's rare. It's a surviving, reproducing valley oak woodland with all of the understory, mature, and never really destroyed because it was too wet for anybody in the last 150, 180 years to do any construction back there. It flooded. And as a result, we still have significant remnants of that oak woodlands. When the city did the Petaluma River Access and Enhancement, along with about 20 other folks, the city council and the planning commission restricted us to look only at the lands, the parcels that were immediately adjacent to the river. So in some places, if the parcels are large, you have a large area that is included in the plan. In other places where the parcels were narrow, the pathway, the reserved areas are very narrow. It's not designed based on ecological values. It's not designed based on what should be preserved as a well-integrated, complex ecosystem. That needs to be revisited. And if development is planned on the next round of general plans strictly on the basis of, well, okay, we have this strip that was outlined in the River Access and Enhancement Plan, we will lose an extraordinarily valuable resource for the city. When we were looking at the outlet mall, one of the things we proposed to the city and the developer was that entire Corona Reach, maybe 250 or 300 acres, become a central park. Now we have a new central park at McNear Peninsula. That's all dredge spills. It's going to need to be vegetated. It never was a forested area. However, we have this several thousand-year-old forested area upstream. And that area should be an integrated large park as you go north towards Corona. There are large flatlands that have been stripped and yet are accessible to the west side, which remarkably does not have any ball fields suitable for organized sports for kids over 6 on the west side. Everybody's got to go to the east side. So this is multi-use possibilities there if we think big. There is money that is available from Open Space District, from the Land Trust, from TN Nature Conservancy, and others who want to see that land taken out of circulation. If we build Rainier right through the middle of it, Rainier has to come with major development because that's the only way it's going to get paid for. And so developers since the 1980s have been looking to develop all this flat land in prime view of the freeway. It's flat. Oh, it floods. Well, somebody else will deal with that. Somebody else will pay for it. We don't have to do that. We can be a river city that enjoys, treasures, values this land literally for the next 100 years or more. And when you think about timelines, and I'm glad Christina and Callie were talking about timelines as well, in addition to the natural timelines of our ecosystems, if you build a wood frame house, its average lifespan is 100 years. Modern commercial high rises, 200 to 300 years. So we are building now what Europe built and other cultures built 200-300 years ago, and we don't have a clue that that's what we're doing. So one of the most important things that we can do as we go through with the consultants and the design and shape of the general plan updates, let's reserve the public spaces, the natural spaces first, because after they're lost, you'll never get them back. And so that's really the guidance that needs to happen for the upper river.
Okay, we have a question from Taryn. How do we get city to use a forward-thinking flood map that weighs up sea level rise and importance of biodiversity rather than obsolete or otherwise less than big thinking FEMA maps, or worse, developers' flood map surveys.
Callie, you want to pick that up?
No, I was looking at Christina.
Oh man,
She's
I
the
don't want to talk
regulator.
about FEMA.
She's the regulator. Go.
Oh no, well, I'm not. Yeah, I can't. I don't even know who I would call at FEMA. You know, a great person to talk to about this actually is Kathy Schaefer. She led the updating of the FEMA maps in the Bay Area a number of years ago, and then she retired from FEMA. She's actually getting her PhD now at UC Davis at the Center for Watershed Science, and she could speak. She could speak to how, you know, how to work with FEMA. I think, you know, something leadership respond. I mean, the whole point of this forum is that you want leadership to respond to the desires of the community, right? So, you know, it's up to the community. The way you get the city to use a forward-thinking flood map is you advocate for them to from a multi-benefit standpoint. We're seeing kind of a shift in the world of flood control right now where, apologies to the older white men on the phone call, but for a very long time, it was a world dominated by older white men who had a very traditional civil engineering, public works approach to flood control, which was, you know, straighten it, get the water off the landscape as quickly as possible, move the flood peak downstream as quickly as possible, and not recognizing the co-benefits, you know, not realizing that nature deals with floods in a certain way for a lot of different reasons, right? So I think it's really important for the community to advocate for flood control that considers integrated surface water and groundwater, you know, frankly, as a start, you know, to recommend, you know, to recognize that by slowing and spreading it and sinking it, not only are you making your surface water challenge easier, but you're also replenishing your groundwater and making it easier for your, you know, rural community members that may be dependent on wells. You know, SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, is kind of looming. I don't believe Petaluma is a priority basin under that, but I could be wrong. I'm not a groundwater person, frankly. So, but, you know, you can advocate for, you know, advocate for giving rivers room, advocate for, frankly, for a huge thing you can do is ask your leaders to develop estimates of flood peak that are not based on historic information. A lot of flood control is based on things like the Q100, which is the 100-year flood flow. That's almost always based on historic data. It's based on historic rates of precipitation, historic rates of runoff. We know, and I know that Scott Dosterhoff talked to you guys a while ago, you know, climate change isn't just raising sea levels, but it's changing the intensity and duration and frequency of precipitation on the landscape. And regardless of whether or not the average is going to be wetter or drier, we know that more of our precipitation is going to arrive in these big extreme events, these big atmospheric rivers. And we don't really have robust guidance from the state about what that's going to look like. We don't have a probabilistic framework the way we do for sea level rise of what these different types of storm events might look like. So I would encourage your decision makers when they're coming up with their flood control strategies to recognize that if you use old data, you're going to get it wrong. And, you know, and it's difficult because no one can exactly predict the future, but you're bound to fail if you're going to use historic flood data to inform your future flood resilience efforts.
And the remarkable thing is that firm mapping, flood insurance rate mapping, is all retrospective.
Yes, and that's something that Kathy can talk about at length. The politics.
You know, when we come in and say, well, this property is out of the floodplain or the 1% floodplain. Well, okay, that was up until the point of mapping, when FEMA gathered the data and Brown Engineering in Virginia did their final check on it. But that's changing rapidly, and anything that's based on firm maps, on FEMA's existing flood maps, is out of date. And both the Association of State and Local Floodplain Managers, all located in Wisconsin, a great resource, as well as the state's OES Director, Office of Emergency Services, told me that floodplains are not only out of date at the moment they're published, but that they're frequently as much as 12 inches or more out of date. Why? Because when you build when you have a flood map, now you go ahead and build upstream. You asphalt and pave areas. You increase the runoff, decrease the permeability of the soils by building on it, and it's supposed to be that the local floodplain manager is supposed to keep the increase in flood levels to under 12 inches to preserve the insurance capability in the area. But that is never enforced. And asking FEMA and asking the state, is there ever any enforcement where an insured area is cut out of insurance because the local floodplain manager has allowed the flooding to go over 12 inches? The answer is no. So it's a defective planning tool. By the way, I don't call it flood control, I call it flood management, because there will always be floods larger than what was planned for. So what do you do to manage those events and keep people safe and reduce the risks?
Okay, Christina, I had a question for you. Seems to be that there's a lot of requests from the comments. Since things are kind of happening faster than the data is allowed to be produced, what sort of steps would you recommend that our community take to educate ourselves and to be connected and to kind of have our finger on the pulse as to information, maps, data? How can we enlist information in the area of both flood and resilience, and then also like biodiversity?
Sure. Well, I think, Petaluma is really fortunate in that regard, in that, San Francisco Bay is an area where a lot of cutting edge science is really being done. And you've got two organizations right in your backyard that are leading that charge with science, and that's the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and also headquartered in Point Blue, or in Petaluma, Point Blue Conservation Science. So they're developing a tremendous number of data and information products. I mean, that Petaluma Historic Ecology report that was completed a few years ago, that's fantastic. Scott Dusterhoff, who spoke to you previously, I'm sure he mentioned Flood Control 2.0 and the Healthy Watersheds Resilient Baylands initiatives. Those are taking much more integrative, cross-disciplinary, forward-thinking approaches to flood management and developing multi-benefit systems of multi-benefit ways of adapting to climate change. So, I would certainly encourage folks to go to the websites of those organizations. Now in the age of Zoom, there are 1,000,001 opportunities to learn more about the science. There's also a Petaluma Baylands. I would have been surprised if Scott didn't mention this, but there's also a Petaluma Baylands planning effort that's currently being done. Jeremy Lowe of the San Francisco Estuary Institute is running it, and they're developing a comprehensive vision and strategy for the Petaluma Baylands. They did a similar strategy for the Sonoma Baylands, done with a really broad cross section of stakeholders. Including environmental groups and counties and regulatory agencies. So yeah, folks, I would encourage, and I'm happy to, I can create a list of resources that I can send out to all of you that can go out in your newsletter or your ICDN. Yeah. So there's tons of information out there, and happy to connect you all with that.
Well, I think we're kind of it sounds to me like we're kind of in this space where we have our general plan being rewritten or updated, and we have all this information, and it's just going to be really exciting to try to implement a lot of these ideas and resiliency ideas that you have proposed within our general plan.
And really quickly about that, Veronica, I put this in the chat, but just so folks know, Petaluma is far from the first community to face these challenges. And decades ago, the Water Board started working very closely with the city of Napa and Napa County. They're in a similar landscape position, at the mouth of a giant river, a much larger watershed, much bigger flows than the Petaluma River, at the junction of the river and the Baylands. And so, it's taken them decades. They've implemented a flood control strategy that has restored Baylands, restored tidal marshes downstream of the city, widened the channel, and created restored floodplains upstream of the city. So these are all things that have been done before. None of these are, crazy, wild ideas. And I certainly encourage folks to look at how Napa's done it, and that may perhaps provide some inspiration for how Petaluma could think about things.
And even on a small scale, village homes in Davis, perfect example of how to use runoff from a subdivision to increase groundwater, slow the flows off the property, and provide for a wonderful urban green environment with heat sinks and with cooling and with fresher air, additional oxygen generation. And that's been around for, over 30 years, over 40 years. A wonderful example of how to do that rather than running it down the streets and down storm sewers. I also want to mention that the Resource Conservation District here has been running for the last 2 or 3 years what's called the Petaluma River Collaborative, which is looking to come up with 10 projects that are fundable for restoration, preservation, and improvement in water quality and biotic features, and that is slowly coming to pass. So pay attention to that one as well.
Right. Let's see, Dan, did you find any other questions? Please, I've been searching through, but I don't have.
I think Tom had one more, but we've addressed so much, or maybe it was John who had one more. But I think we've addressed so much that I'm going to have to go back and watch this one again. This is really good.
Yes, it's been tremendous.
No advertisements.
Yes.
I think what we could do is, because there's been so much information, maybe we could just kind of collate our ideas afterwards, and then maybe put some questions together and try to, just process all of this.
That would be fantastic. Also, if the various presenters don't mind me, I think I got copies beforehand of the PowerPoints and the PDFs. If the various presenters don't mind, I would like to make those available as ancillary information along with the video.
Sure, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
Sounds good to me. I learned a lot. Thank you, Christina. It's been such an informative night. Great to hear from you again, David. You have so much wisdom. Thank you both.
Thank you also. Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Dan, Dave, and all the other folks who are here. Thanks to our city council members who are on this tonight, and folks from the Zone 2A flood district. Yay. Nice to see you.
I just like to give a really, really heartfelt thanks to our speakers, and thank you so much, Callie, for your presentation, David for yours, and Christina for coming to our community. And it's really, really humbling, and we really appreciate you, all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I guess unless somebody else has anything else, then I guess we can close the night and wish everyone well and health. And
yeah, and I believe Dave will probably be sending around the link. Well, if you have not signed up for the weekly updates, do so, and I will make sure that the video and accompanying materials are available as a link in the next mail that Dave sends around.
Excellent.
Wonderful.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good
Thanks,
night.
Veronica.
Thank you,
Christina, Katie, David.
Veronica.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dan. Council members.
Bye.